Welcome to the channel. If you are new here, this is where we go deep into the stories that built the world you live in, the decisions, the inventions, the power plays that shaped everything from the money in your pocket to the company you work for. Not the simplified textbook version, the real version, with all the blood and brilliance left in. Tonight, we are going back 400 years to tell you the story of the single most important company in human history. Not Apple, not Google, not Standard Oil, a company that most people have never heard of. And yet, every corporation on earth, every stock exchange, every limited liability partnership, every venture capital fund, every initial public offering is a direct descendant of what this company invented. It was called the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the United East India Company. You may know it by its initials, the VOC. It was founded in 1602 in the Dutch Republic, a country smaller than Maryland, with a population of roughly 1.5 million people in the middle of a war survival against the most powerful empire on earth. And in the process of trying not to die, this tiny nation accidentally created the organizational technology that would reshape human civilization more profoundly than gunpowder, the printing press, or the steam engine. They invented the corporation, not the word, the thing, the actual mechanism by which strangers pool their money, share the risk, and build something larger than any individual could build alone, something that can outlive every person who created it. Before the VOC, this mechanism did not exist. After the VOC, the entire world was rebuilt on top of it. This is not a story about spices, although spices are in it. This is not a story about ships, although ships are in it. This is a story about a desperation, greed, war, and a single brilliant political compromise produced an invention so powerful that we are still living inside it, right now, 4 centuries later, without most of us ever realizing where it came from. Let us begin. Chapter 1. A Nation Bleeding, the war that made everything necessary. To understand why the Dutch East India Company was created, you first have to understand the world it was born into, and that world was on fire. In the late 1500s, the Dutch Republic was not a global power. It was barely a country. It was a collection of low-lying provinces on the North Sea coast of Europe, populated by merchants, fishermen, and farmers who had made one extremely dangerous decision. They had declared independence from the Spanish Empire. Spain, at that time, was not just any empire, it was the empire. Under King Philip II, Spain controlled vast territories across Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Its treasury was fed by rivers of silver, flowing from the mines of Peru and Mexico. Its military was the most feared in Europe. Its navy dominated the Atlantic. The phrase on which the sun never sets was originally coined to describe the Spanish Empire, not the British one. And this colossus was at war with the Dutch. The conflict, known as the 80 Years' War, had begun in 1568 when the Dutch provinces rebelled against Spanish rule. The causes were complex: a toxic mixture of religious persecution, taxation without representation, and the brutal suppression of local freedoms by Spanish governors. But the result was simple. A tiny, outnumbered, outgunned nation was fighting for its right to exist against the most powerful military machine in the Western world. The war was not going well. Spanish armies had sacked entire cities. Thousands had been executed. The Dutch were surviving through a combination of sheer stubbornness, clever use of their waterlogged geography to slow Spanish advances, and one critical advantage: money. The Dutch were traders, Their geographical position at the mouth of the Rhine made them natural middlemen for European commerce. Amsterdam was rapidly becoming one of the richest cities on the continent, and it was the profits from trade, not taxes from agriculture or tribute from conquered peoples, that funded the Dutch war effort. Every guilder that Dutch merchants earned on the high seas was a guilder that could buy soldiers, ships, and cannons to keep the Spanish at bay. Trade was not just business. Trade was survival. And the most lucrative trade in the world at that time was the spice trade with Asia. Chapter summary. The Dutch Republic was fighting a war for survival against the mighty Spanish Empire. Trade, especially the Asian spice trade, was not a luxury, but the financial lifeline keeping the nation alive. This existential pressure would force the Dutch to invent something entirely new. Chapter 2. The Death Spiral. When your worst enemy is yourself. Here is where the story takes an ironic turn. The Dutch merchants, who were supposed to be funding their nation's survival, were actively destroying each other. By the 1590s, dozens of small Dutch trading companies had sprung up across the Republic's major cities: Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Delft, Middelburg, and Houston. Each one was independently financing voyages to the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia, modern-day Indonesia, where cloves, nutmeg, mace, and pepper could be purchased from local producers at low prices and sold in Europe at astronomical markups. On paper, the economics were irresistible. A single successful voyage could return 400% profit. In practice, the Dutch were walking into a trap of their own making. Picture the scene at the Banda Islands in 1599. A cluster of tiny volcanic islands in the eastern Indonesian archipelago. These were the only place on Earth where nutmeg grew naturally. And into this fragile market sailed not one Dutch fleet, not two, but a dozen, all arriving within weeks of each other, all representing different companies from different Dutch cities, all desperate to buy every available ounce of nutmeg before their competitors could get to it. The local sultans and chiefs, who were not fools, watched this spectacle with delight. When a dozen buyers fight over the same product, the seller sets the price. The Dutch merchants began outbidding each other in a frenzy of competitive panic. What should have cost 10 guilders per barrel was suddenly going for 15, then 20, then 25. They were driving up their own costs with every transaction, cannibalizing their own profit margins before they had even left port. But the damage did not stop there. Months later, when these fleets finally limped back to the Netherlands, battered by storms and disease, carrying their hard-won cargo, the second phase of self-destruction began. A dozen ships arriving in Amsterdam simultaneously meant a sudden glut of spices on the market. And when supply floods in, prices collapse. The merchants who had paid inflated prices in Asia now found themselves competing to sell at deflated prices in Europe. Today's price was 100 guilders per unit. Tomorrow someone was selling at 90. The day after, 80. Within weeks, profit margins that should have been enormous had been squeezed down to almost nothing. Some voyages, after accounting for the cost of ships, crews, supplies, insurance, and the months of capital tied up at sea, actually lost money. This was a textbook death spiral. Competition was destroying the very industry that was supposed to save the nation, and then, as if the situation were not dire enough, the geopolitical landscape shifted in the worst possible way. Chapter summary. Dozens of competing Dutch companies were destroying their own profitability by bidding against each other in Asia and undercutting each other in Europe. The spice trade was being killed not by foreign enemies, but by internal competition. Chapter 3. The hammer falls when Spain swallowed Portugal. In 1580, something happened that sent shockwaves through every trading house in the Netherlands. King Philip II of Spain inherited the crown of Portugal. His mother was a Portuguese princess, and when the Portuguese royal line died out, Philip pressed his claim and merged the two kingdoms into what historians call the Iberian Union, the single largest colonial empire the world had ever seen. This was a catastrophe for the Dutch. Until that moment, Portugal and Spain had been separate powers with separate interests. Portugal controlled the eastern spice trade through its network of fortified trading posts stretching from Mozambique to Macau. Spain controlled the Americas. The Dutch had been able to play them against each other, trading with Portuguese merchants in Lisbon, even while fighting Spanish armies in Flanders. But now, with both crowns on the same head, that game was over. Portugal's commercial network was now part of Spain's imperial machine, and Philip, who was already at war with the Dutch, did exactly what you would expect. He slammed the door shut. Lisbon, which had been Europe's central hub for Asian spices, the place where Dutch merchants had been buying their inventory as middlemen for decades, was closed to Dutch shipping. Overnight, the entire business model of Dutch spice merchants collapsed. This was not just a commercial setback, it was an existential threat. If the Dutch could not trade, they could not generate revenue. If they could not generate revenue, they could not fund their war. If they could not fund their war, Spain would eventually overwhelm them. The logic was simple and terrifying. Find a new way to get spices, or lose the war, or lose the country. The Dutch merchants had no choice. They could no longer buy spices second-hand from Lisbon. They had to go directly to the source. To sail halfway around the world, past the Cape of Good Hope, through the Indian Ocean, into the treacherous waters of the Indonesian archipelago, and buy directly from the producers. The problem was that this route was now controlled by the combined naval forces of Spain and Portugal, two empires that wanted the Dutch dead. Going to the source did not just mean longer voyages and higher costs. It meant sailing into a war zone. Chapter summary. Spain's absorption of Portugal destroyed the Dutch middleman business model and turned the spice route into enemy territory. The Dutch were forced to go direct to Asia, transforming a commercial problem into a military one. Chapter 4. The Architect. One man's solution to an impossible problem. By 1601, the situation had become critical. Dutch merchants were bleeding money from internal competition. The Spanish-Portuguese Union had turned the spice trade into a military operation. The war for independence was draining the national treasury. Something had to change, and it had to change fast. The man who forced that change was Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, the Grand Pensionary of the Dutch Republic, effectively the nation's prime minister in all but title. Van Oldenbarnevelt was not a merchant. He was as a lawyer, a diplomat, and a political operator of extraordinary skill. He understood something that the merchants, blinded by their individual rivalries, could not see. A collection of competing small companies would never defeat a unified empire. The only way to fight a national enemy was with a national champion. In 1602, he summoned the directors of every major Dutch trading company to The Hague, the political capital of the Republic. Representatives from Amsterdam, Middelburg, Delft, Rotterdam, Hoorn, and Enkhuizen, men who had spent years trying to bankrupt each other were brought together in the same room and told in terms that were polite but left no room for negotiation that they were going to merge, all of them, into one company, whether they liked it or not. They did not like it. Every director in that room had built his business from nothing, had risked his capital, had buried partners and crew members who did not survive the voyage. The idea of surrendering their independence to a collective entity was, to put it mildly, unwelcome. But Van Oldenbarnevelt was not asking. He was backed by the States General, the Dutch National Parliament, and he made it clear that the alternative to cooperation was government regulation. That would be far less pleasant. He also made it clear that he was offering something in return, something that had never been offered to any commercial enterprise in history. A charter, a license, a set of powers so extraordinary that they would transform this new company from a trading firm into something closer to a sovereign state. But first, he had to solve the fundamental problem. How do you get thousands of people to put their money into a single company that is about to sail into a war zone on the other side of the world, where ships sank, crews died of scurvy, and entire cargoes could be lost to storms, pirates, or enemy warships? Chapter Summary. Van Oldenbarnevelt, a political leader, not a merchant, recognized that only a unified national company could compete against a unified empire. He forced a merger of all competing Dutch trading companies, and then faced the challenge of making this new entity attractive to investors. Chapter 5. The 4 inventions that changed everything. What Van Oldenbarnevelt and his collaborators created was not just a company. It was a package of 4 interlocking innovations, each one revolutionary on its own, but together forming a system so powerful that it would become the template for every corporation that has existed since. These 4 inventions were stock shares, limited liability, permanent capital, and legal personhood. Let me walk you through each one, because understanding them is understanding the DNA of the modern world. The first invention was transferable stock shares. Before the VOC, if you wanted to invest in a trading voyage, you joined a partnership. You put your money in, the ship sailed, and when it came back, you either got your money back with profit, or you lost everything. Each voyage was a separate deal. The VOC destroyed this model entirely. Instead of investing in a single voyage, you bought a share of the entire company. Your ownership was represented by a piece of paper that entitled you to a proportional slice of all the company's profits from all its voyages forever. And here was the revolutionary part. These shares were available to everyone, not just wealthy merchants, not just political insiders, everyone. For the first time in commercial history, an ordinary person, a shopkeeper, a widow, a servant with savings stuffed under a mattress, could own a piece of a global enterprise. The VOC's first share offering attracted investors from every level of Dutch society. Records show that mates, small tradesmen, and even children purchased shares through their guardians. Capital, which had always been the exclusive weapon of the rich, was suddenly democratized. The second invention was limited liability. This was perhaps the most psychologically important innovation of all. In the 1600s, business debt was personal debt. If your trading venture failed and owed money to creditors, those creditors could come after everything you owned: your house, your furniture, your clothes, your future earnings. Bankruptcy did not just destroy your business, it destroyed your life, your family, your children's future. This made people extremely reluctant to invest in anything risky. The VOC changed the rules. It declared that an investor's maximum loss was limited to the amount they had invested. If you bought 100 guilders worth of VOC shares and the company collapsed entirely, you lost 100 guilders. Not your house, not your savings, not your wedding ring. 100 guilders. Companies' debts were the company's problem, not yours. This single innovation transformed the psychology of investment. It did not eliminate risk. It contained it. It put a floor under the worst-case scenario. And by doing so, it unlocked a flood of capital from people who would never have risked a single coin under the old rules. The risk was still real, but it was no longer existential. The distinction changed everything. The third invention was permanent capital. In traditional partnerships, investors could withdraw their money at the end of each voyage. This meant that the company never had stable, long-term funding. It could not plan ahead. It could not build infrastructure. It could not invest in projects that would take years to pay off. The VOC solved this by locking in its investors' capital for a minimum of 10 years. Your money was committed. You could not pull it out on a whim. After 10 years, if you wanted your money back, you did not get to withdraw it from the company. You had to find someone else who wanted to buy your shares. This design gave the company something no trading enterprise had ever possessed before: a permanent pool of capital that could be deployed for long-term strategic objectives, building fortresses on the other side of the world, establishing permanent trading posts, constructing entire fleets, negotiating treaties that would take decades to bear fruit. The VOC could think in decades because its capital was measured in decades, not voyages. The fourth invention was legal personhood. Before the VOC, a business was inseparable from the people who owned it. When an owner died, the business often died with him. Partners fought over assets. Contracts became unenforceable. Institutional knowledge evaporated. The VOC was constituted as a legal entity separate from any individual. It could sign contracts in its own name. It could sue and be sued. It could own property. It existed independently of its shareholders, its directors, and its employees. If every single person associated with the VOC had died simultaneously, the company itself, as a legal entity, would have survived. It was a commercial organism that transcended human mortality. It could outlive any founder, any director, any generation of investors, and it did. The VOC operated for nearly 200 years. Chapter summary. The VOC introduced 4 revolutionary innovations. Stock shares democratized capital. Limited liability. Contained risk. Permanent capital enabled long-term strategy. Legal personhood created an entity that could outlive its creators. Together, these 4 inventions created the template for every modern corporation. Chapter 6. The License to Conquer. The most extraordinary charter in history. The internal architecture of the VOC was revolutionary enough. But Van Oldenbarneveld added something else, something that turned this commercial enterprise into a force of nature. The Dutch government issued the VOC, a charter, a set of officially sanctioned powers that, by any modern standard, were absolutely extraordinary. To understand why these powers were granted, you have to remember the context. The VOC was not sailing into a peaceful marketplace. It was sailing into a war zone, controlled by the combined naval forces of Spain and Portugal. Its ships would be attacked. Its trading posts would be besieged. Its crews would be captured and killed. A normal company, one that merely bought and sold goods, would have been annihilated within months. So the charter gave the VOC the powers of a state. It could raise its own army and navy, not a few guards on a merchant ship, a professional military force with warships, soldiers, cannons, and fortifications. At its peak, the VOC employed tens of thousands of soldiers and operated dozens of warships, a military establishment larger than those of most European nations. The charter authorized the VOC to declare war and negotiate peace in the name of the Dutch Republic. A trading company could decide, on its own authority, to go to war against a foreign power. It could negotiate treaties. It could form alliances. It could sign binding agreements with kings and sultans that carried the full weight of Dutch sovereignty. The charter allowed the VOC to establish colonies, build fortresses, appoint governors, administer justice, and even mint its own currency. In the territories it controlled, the VOC was not a corporation in any sense we would recognize today. It was a government. It collected taxes. It enforced laws. It executed criminals. It ruled. This was the ultimate public-private partnership. The Dutch government provided legitimacy, legal authority, and the implicit backing of the Dutch state. The VOC provided capital, ships, men, and the willingness to project Dutch power to the far side of the world, at no direct cost to the national treasury. The government got an empire without paying for one. The company got a license to print money, backed by state-sanctioned violence. It was elegant, it was ruthless, and it worked. Chapter summary. The Dutch government's charter transformed the VOC from a trading company into a state-backed war machine, with the power to raise armies, declare war, build colonies, and mint currency. The most extreme corporate license in history, born from the necessity of fighting a global empire. Chapter 7. The Flood. When a nation bet everything on a piece of paper. When the VOC opened its shares to the public in 1602, the response was unlike anything the commercial world had ever seen. The subscription points in Amsterdam, Middelburg, and other Dutch cities were overwhelmed. Investors of every social class lined up to purchase shares. Wealthy merchants bought large blocks. Middle-class tradesmen bought what they could afford. Servants and working people pooled their savings to buy even a single share. The total capital raised was 6.5 million Dutch guilders, a sum so large that it defies easy modern comparison. To put it in perspective, consider this. At the same time, the annual revenue of the English crown under Queen Elizabeth I was approximately 350,000 English pounds. Converting at the exchange rate of the period, the VOC's initial offering raised the equivalent of roughly 600,000 pounds, nearly 2 full years of English government revenue, collected not through taxes or conquest, but through voluntary investment by private citizens. A single company had raised more money in one offering than a major European monarchy. Collected in 2 years, the implications were staggering. For the first time in history, private capital had been organized on a scale that rivaled national treasuries. The power of the crowd, channeled through the mechanism of stock shares, had produced a financial force that could outspend kings. But the most profound consequence of the VOC's structure was not the money it raised. It was what happened afterward. Remember, the VOC's shares were permanent. You could not return them to the company for a refund. If you needed cash, your only option was to sell your shares to someone else. This created an entirely new market, a market not for goods or services, but for ownership itself. Within months of the VOC's founding, an informal market in VOC shares had emerged on the bridges and in the coffee houses of Amsterdam. Buyers and sellers met, negotiated prices, and exchanged shares. Prices fluctuated based on news from Asia, rumors of military victories or defeats, speculation about future dividends, and the endless, irrational, deeply human oscillation between greed and fear. By 1611, this informal market had grown so large and so active that it required a permanent home. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange was established, the world's first dedicated securities exchange, a physical building where shares in the VOC could be bought and sold every business day with standardized rules, official hours, and recognized brokers. A share certificate, originally nothing more than a receipt proving that you had invested money in a company, had transformed into something entirely new, a financial asset with a market price that changed continuously based on supply, demand, and expectation. Ownership itself had become a commodity. A piece of paper representing a fraction of a company's value could now be traded, speculated on, used as collateral for loans, or held as a store of wealth. The capital market, the mechanism that today moves trillions of dollars every day, that funds every startup and every multinational, that determines your mortgage rate and your retirement portfolio, was born in Amsterdam in 1602 as a side effect of the VOC's decision to make its shares permanent and transferable. The Dutch did not invent a faster ship. They did not invent a more powerful cannon. They invented a more powerful way to organize human beings. They used stock shares to solve the problem of scale. They used limited liability to solve the problem of fear. They used permanent capital to solve the problem of short-term thinking. They used legal personhood to solve the problem of mortality. And in doing so, they created a commercial beast the world had never seen, an entity whose veins ran with the pool capital of an entire nation, whose skeleton was forged from state-sanctioned authority, and whose brain was controlled by a board of the most brilliant and most ruthless businessmen of their age. Chapter Summary. The VOC's IPO raised capital rivaling national treasuries. The permanent share structure gave birth to the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the world's first security market. Ownership itself became a tradable commodity, launching the era of capital markets that still governs the global economy today. So here is the question I want to leave you with. You now work for corporations. You own shares in corporations. Your pension is invested in corporations. The food you eat, the phone you are watching this on, the platform delivering this video to your screen, all are products of corporations. The corporation is the dominant organizational form of human civilization. It employs more people than any government. It controls more wealth than most nations. It shapes your daily life in ways so pervasive that you do not even notice them. And all of it, every single piece of it, traces back to a desperate decision made by a small country at war 400 years ago, in a meeting room in The Hague, where a group of merchants who hated each other were forced to sit down and build something together, because the alternative was annihilation. The corporation was not invented by visionaries with a grand plan for human progress. It was invented by people who were terrified, people who needed a weapon, people who looked at an impossible situation. A tiny nation against a global empire, limited resources against unlimited enemies, individual weakness against collective strength, and found a way to turn individual weakness into collective power. That is what the VOC teaches us. That the most transformative inventions in history are almost never the product of comfort and abundance. They are the product of constraint and necessity. The corporation was born from war, from desperation, from the absolute refusal to accept an outcome that seemed inevitable, and it changed everything. The next time you buy a share of stock, the next time you read about an IPO, the next time you hear someone talk about limited liability or shareholder value or corporate governance, remember where it all came from. Remember the merchants who were destroying each other. Remember the statesmen who locked them in a room. Remember the charter that gave a company the powers of a nation. And remember the servant girl in Amsterdam who took her life savings, walked to a subscription counter, and bought a share in an enterprise that was sailing toward the other side of the world, into waters patrolled by enemy warships, with no guarantee of return. She was the first retail investor, and she changed the world. If this story changed how you see the companies around you, if it made you realize that the systems you live inside were not inevitable, but were built by specific people, at specific moments for specific reasons, then do this. Hit subscribe. This is what we do here. We go behind the surface of history and show you the machinery underneath, the decisions and inventions that built the world you inherited. Share this with someone who thinks history is boring, because this is not boring. This is the origin story of everything. And leave a comment. Tell me, now that you know how the corporation was invented, does it change how you feel about working for one? Part 2 is coming. Because we have not yet answered the most important question. What happened when this commercial beast, this machine, built for profit and armed with the powers of a state, was unleashed upon the world? What did it do with all that money and all that power? The answer is extraordinary and terrible. I will see you in the next one.